Hello there, everyone. Welcome back to the class, both to new and long-time students and lovers of history. This is History with Sai here today to discuss with you further on the US civil rights. If you haven't already, do check out our previous video. We've built up now to this point. We're in the middle of the 1950s and we're seeing ourselves some rapid change about to occur. As always, remember this lesson is catered towards the student level, key knowledge, and of course our video is dedicated to some historical skill practice along the way. With all that said, notepads and pens at the ready, and let us begin. So we left the previous lesson with, of course, the executive part of the government seeming quite passive, quite inactive in the cases with Lafayette Lucy and Emmett Till. However, while Eisenhower could be seen as a do-nothing president, there are other parts of the government that are acting and are indeed trying to do things to get some change across in regards to civil rights. What are they? Well, let's find out. So the first major thing we want to look at is Brown versus the Board of Topeka. This is a major step forward in the Supreme Court getting involved and committing actions to improve civil rights. Now, what exactly does this concern? Well, Brown versus Topeka was a major step forward to improve education, especially for African Americans. It concerned the case of a school student in Kansas, and the Supreme Court under Earl Warren really made a big stand for voting unanimously on this. All 9 judges in the case ruled that even if the facilities were deemed equal, there was still separate education occurring that was going to be psychologically harmful for those African Americans. Plus, well, there was still, of course, the sheer truth that African American schools were getting less funding from the federal government than white schools were, not on a psychological level, but on an economic level, they were still unequal as well. And so the Brown ruling was a major step forward because it called for all schools, not just those in the North, but now the South as well, to be desegregated and to have mixed classes instead. Big reasoning for this is that by having these mixed classes, it would mean the students would see each other as equal as well, and therefore we hope that in the future this will reduce the high level of racism, especially in the southern states. It also showed the Supreme Court, this key vital part of government, could be used by things like the NAACP and Thurgood Marshall to strike down the racist laws that were in the South. We did mention Thurgood Marshall before. Thurgood Marshall is a key judge who is acting for the NAACP, and he is working very hard to try and get these legislations passed to make sure equality can be achieved for the African Americans. Warren's court, and again Warren as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, had ensured this was a unanimous victory. As I said, all 9 judges voted in favor of this. So we have a clear message here that racism is going to be unacceptable in American society, especially going forward now in the mid-1950s. However, a big problem for this ruling is that the southern states were still going to resist it. And it's all well and good the Supreme Court passing these laws, but if the federal government doesn't intervene and doesn't get involved to make sure they actually become de facto real change, then they just remain de jure change that the Southerners can simply opt out of, again with the Dixiecrat majority that they hold. Brown versus Topeka was quite an inspiring thing for the African American community, and it showed them that their activism and using the courts could be a clear path to try and gain some success and achieve those civil rights and equality. And so with that in mind, the African American community decided to band together and put to the test if the Supreme Court ruling could and indeed would be followed by those southern states especially. They understood that much like what had happened with Offer and Lucy, there'd be a massive white backlash, and many of the whites would campaign and put up a big resistance to try and stop them from desegregating in education especially. The most famous case of this is the Little Rock case in Arkansas. What exactly is this? Well, let us find out. Now, Little Rock was a city in the state of Arkansas, and like a lot of southern states, it believed that it had time to try and pass this ruling. It was not going to be forced to comply with it straight away. And so there was initial plans to only desegregate by 1963, nearly a decade after Brown v. Topeka had been announced. However, the NAACP pushed for this desegregation to happen much sooner, and so it pushed for this integration to occur at Central High School, moved to have 9 African Americans be entered into the school in September 1957. However, Arkansas's governor, Orville Forbes, was a very ardent racist, and he was very keen to secure re-election and maintain control of the state. So when these 9 students moved in and tried to attend the school in September 1957, Forbes instead used Arkansas's own National Guard to keep the students out. The National Guard were these state reserves who the president, in theory, could control and have power over, especially during an emergency. But initially, the state's governor could be the one to control them first. And so, using the National Guard, he put them in place to prevent the students from integrating and going to the classes within the school. On the day he did this, the NAACP moved to protect the students and, of course, kept under their watch to stop the white crowds from attacking them. However, one child, Elizabeth Eckford, as you can see in the image on the right, went on her own without any NAACP protection. The National Guard moved in and stopped her from attending the school, and very quickly a white mob descended on her to attack and shout at her, and some even called for her to be lynched. It's important to remember that Eckford is only 15 years old in 1957. She's a teenager, only a year older than Emmett Till, but yet she's been subjugated to all this abuse. And the key part with this is that it makes national media. 250 reporters and photographers are working on this day. Because again, this is a momentous occasion for these African Americans to be integrated into the Central High School. And so it's being caught on camera, caught on television, and being seen around the nation. One reporter even tries to interview Eckford, and she just sits on a bench despondent and does not respond to him in any real way. All in all, though, it's quite chaotic, and it's clear that this racial mob is quite strong, quite fervent in the South. And despite the Supreme Court ruling of Brown v. Topeka, the de facto reality is these poor students can't attend school. Eventually, this escalates even further with the white mob, so we end up with complete riots occurring all throughout Little Rock. It is only when this chaos really fires up that the President, Eisenhower himself, finally intervenes beyond just mere words and talking to Forbes, but he actually decides to send in federal troops. This is the 101st Airborne, and they move in to protect the Little Rock Nine and finally force integration within the schools. However, the sad tragedy is that despite the federal troops intervening, protecting the students, keeping them safe so they can attend their classes, sit in the dining hall, and make it home safely every day, Forbes instead goes even more extreme and decides in 1958, the following year, close the school to prevent integration from even being possible. And these are the extremes that these white Southerners will go to ensure that integration cannot occur. That's how deeply they believe in this racist value that the African Americans can't mix with them in any capacity. Therefore, despite the de jure success of Brown v. Topeka, in practice there is tremendous resistance, especially in the southern states, for this to become a de facto reality. It took the intervention of Eisenhower, the intervention of federal troops, to make this possible. But even then, Forbes just closes the school. And also, the clear demonstration of the white dominated law that there is in the South, how they could use the National Guard. National Guard's there for the protection of all Americans, but yet they're only, quote unquote, protecting the whites. And of course, actually harming and hindering life for the African Americans instead. Eisenhower as well looked quite passive. Maybe he really was a know-nothing president. And again, although we see a slight improvement here, he actually has reacted. He's got involved in this case, unlike how he did with Emmett Till and Arthur Ryan Lucy. We still see here this big reluctance to get involved, whether that's because of his own southern origins as well, being from Kansas. All in all, we see here he has no real clear moral leadership in regards to civil rights. And despite the success of the Warren Court to get this passed, we still see the president, as the words of a speechwriter Arthur Lawson once said, that he was neither emotionally nor intellectually in favor of combating segregation, especially in these southern states. So, is Eisenhower liberal on people? It's very difficult to say if he is. Perhaps it certainly isn't with an American community. But something we should note here is the clear power of television. This was a very isolated case, but because of the media, because of their intervention and getting it shown on TV, it makes it very difficult to ignore when you're watching it on your new prime TV and you're seeing these images beamed to you in your living room while you're having dinner, while you're hanging out with friends and family. But what is very clear here is that federal action truly isn't enough. Supreme Court rulings truly isn't enough. And perhaps the African Americans will have to use more direct action, more grassroots protest to really enforce change and make it de facto rather than simply de jure. How will they do that? What will they do to ensure this can happen and go beyond what's happened at Little Rock, federal actions at Eisenhower? Well, that's what we're going to find out in our following lesson when we get onto the case of Montgomery, Rosa Parks, and the bus boycott. As always, thank you for watching. I do hope you found this insightful as always. Do make sure you subscribe so you can keep up with this video series. And of course, comment below how you're finding the series, what you're learning so far, and of course, how you're finding it all. With all that said, I look forward to seeing you in the following lesson. This has been History with Sire. Thank you for listening.